So we've got $1.5 trillion in commercial mortgages that have to get refinanced in the next 18 months. There's a survey in Bloomberg last week that real estate investors, like 2/3 of them, say it's headed for a severe collapse. So it seems bad. I don't know. Can you ballpark it for us?
It is bad. Okay. That's the challenge. It's, the challenge is that, and this is different than what we experienced in the financial crisis in 08 and 09, in the sense that was really, we had some systemically important institutions that had a lot of speculation, and a lot of people were borrowing speculatively, and that then blew up, and then we were able to inject capital. This is a little bit different in the sense that we went through over a decade and a half of an environment where we're at near zero interest rates, and that became just the way the world was functioning. As a matter of fact, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, just over a year and a half ago, was saying expected to be that way. So people weren't being irresponsible, but they were pricing buildings and pricing companies and borrowing and leveraging themselves what they thought was conservative. But now that as interest rates have gone up at this meteoric rate and historically faster than ever before off of this very low base, whatever was bought in that early period of time, that's a low interest rate regime, doesn't work today. And the challenge, and why this is the early innings of this challenge, is it's going to manifest itself as each of these loans start to mature. And it's not just commercial real estate, right? It's going to be corporate loans, leveraged buyouts. As they all start to mature into 24 and 25, the day of reckoning will come. And it's going to require a significant re-equitization and deleveraging that we saw. The last time we've seen something like this was probably in the early 90s. And so it's a multi-year process that we got to get through.
Talk about that dynamic a little bit, because you've got sponsors who have to decide, run the math and decide whether it's worth it to put money in. You have lenders that don't really want these things. I mean, you have a building, like 61 Broadway, that defaulted this spring. And I don't know, would you put more money in that thing? Is that salvageable? How do you think about the capital structure when you have to reset it?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and and look at the space that we're in here, right? I think the way that real estate was changing in terms of how people thought about real estate, office, retail, how they live, was changing pre-COVID. COVID accelerated a lot of that, right? So when you think about an office building as an example, a old, dark office building without good air, good light, in a bad neighborhood, no one wants to come back to work to that, just as the mayor had said in his comments, right? I mean, they want to come back to something that it's about hospitality, about experience, about engaging. And we saw the same thing when e-commerce first took hold and people could buy online, and they'd go online or they'd go to the mall, where everyone said, well, no one's ever going to go back to a mall again. But certain malls learned to say, well, we're going to reimagine ourselves to be an entertainment hub and outing for people. And those are the office buildings that are going to be successful in the future, and you're seeing this wide divergence in terms of those buildings. We at RXR have coined it Project Kodak with our own portfolio and more broadly around the city. Which of the buildings are digital that will have a future, and which are film that we shouldn't be investing in, to your point. And so that is, I think, the quality of the building that you have to start with. But even the ones that are digital, that if you're going to invest in, you have to look at the capital structure and the level of debt on that, and to make sure that it can compete, because all the basis has to come down in a world where you have higher interest rates, higher expenses, and values that are lower. So on a 61 Broadway is an example that you raised, is one that we publicly deemed, I think last February, as a building that was film. And we told the lender that we're not going to invest more capital in this building. We'll work with you. We'll try to sell it for whatever it's worth. And we expected it would be worth about half of what the debt was. Now, we had sold a 49% interest back in 2016. We had no capital left in the building ourselves, so it was not, we weren't going to put good money after bad. And the lender went out to the marketplace, and frankly, that's where it's fallen, right? About half of what it's expected. And so I would say in just the last 6 to 8 weeks, and you've seen some in the headlines and some behind closed doors, lenders are starting to get realistic about where values are coming in. Transactions are starting to happen. As those transactions and those values are crystallized, it's harder for other institutions to close their eyes and not reprice their existing loans or their existing properties, which will then accelerate this process of creating this re-equitization. And then which owners decide to deleverage, which lenders decide to take losses in exchange for new equity capital being put into the buildings, and which ones don't, and ultimately, hopefully, would get sold. The big challenge, particularly on the office side, but I would say across all commercial real estate, is that after SVB and the regional bank collapse, there's tremendous pressure from banks and insurance companies to reduce their real estate exposure. And all real estate's being painted with the same brush. And so they're not in the mood to lend, they're more in the mood to just have you refinance them out, but there's no lenders to refinance out today.
3 years out from the start of this kind of work from home experiment, on a good day, most office towers in major cities are half full. At what point do you stop being able to say, it'll come back, this is now structural? And what does that mean for those buildings? What does it mean for the stuff that you can, I want to talk about the building you're putting up, but what does it mean for what you can build and what you can lease?
So I think the answer has been determined already. I think hybrid work is here to stay. That means different things for different companies, but generally I think it's coalescing around 3 or 4 days a week, some with maybe days that are fixed, some maybe with more flexibility. The concept of full remote work is, I think, fading away quickly, other than certain specific sectors, narrow sectors. So now if you're 3 or 4 days a week, that changes, again, the nature of your office space. You still need almost the same amount of office space. But the biggest thing is the ecosystem, the urban ecosystem is thrown off balance, right? If people are here only 3 days a week, what's the utilization of our transit systems that are predicated on 5 days a week of ridership, or those local restaurants or those local stores that expect people to be in their community all 5 days a week? And that becomes a challenge. And if you look at our occupancy, for example, and it's very interesting, post Labor Day, we've been about 70% of where we were post 2019, pre-2019. But if you look through those numbers, you look Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we're like 90%, right? So it's Monday and Friday is dragging all that down. And so we have to reimagine our ecosystem, our urban ecosystem, to be able to now accommodate a situation like this, which we've done before in Lower Manhattan, post 9/11, which for all of us who lived in New York during, pre 9/11, remember 9 to 5, that was even, everything was sort of below ground, and then on the weekends, no one was there. And now you go to Lower Manhattan today, and it is a vibrant community with people living there, working there, playing, restaurants, schools, parks. So there is a model to get it done, but it doesn't just happen, right? It doesn't just happen. And that's, I think the big thing about New York, and I know the mayor, I don't disagree, this is the greatest city in the world, and it will be the greatest city in the world, but it's not preordained. It takes leadership, it takes intentional policies, it takes cooperation from business, civic, and government to come together. But this whole preordained concept is a risk, right? Because then people don't make the tough decisions to make the policies to actually help accelerate this process.
But into that market, you are going to bring, I think it'll start in a couple of years, one of the tallest towers in New York City. I think it's 2 million square feet or so of office space.
2.8 million feet with the hotel.
Closer to 3.
Right.
Into a city that seems to have too much of it. And I understand the point you're making about they have the wrong type or in the wrong place. Like, what makes you think there's demand for that?
And so, there's been a what I'll call a trifurcation of office space around the country, but New York in particular. You have these uber high-end new towers like One Vanderbilt, or what you're seeing in Hudson Yards, with this tremendous demand from companies that are willing to pay significantly higher, almost double or more than double, market price than you would get for a traditional A building. And then the other side of the coin, you have these old buildings that I talked about that are competitively obsolete, and there's almost no price that someone would pay to be there. In the middle is this sort of the Class A, and there's different gradations. Our belief is that, and what we're seeing is the occupancy of those super uber buildings is in the high 90s, and those rents are still being gotten. Liz was speaking about a building that we would be building adjacent to Grand Central. We bought the air rights over Grand Central Development air rights and tearing down the Hyatt Hotel that Donald Trump had made him famous and built. We'll tear that down and build what would be the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere that reflects a lot of like this and of what the office of the future was. As a matter of fact, I know we're in a Korean firm. Last week or the week before, the mayor of Seoul came to New York, met with the mayor. The other thing he wanted to have in his tour is he wanted to tour our marketing suite for 175 Park Avenue, the building that you're referring to see what the building of the future looks like. So the greatest city and the greatest building in this great city.
Mayor was here earlier. Ben asked him about this sort of grand plan to take all these empty commercial buildings and convert them into residential. Practically, does that work? Many of them would end up being affordable housing, so financially, does that work? It sort of seems ridiculous, but you operate buildings, so
Right.
Does that work?
I mean, and the answer is it works, but not on grand scale, right? But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be pursued, because you think about it. We have some of these problems, right? We have old buildings that are obsolete and can't function in the original purpose, and we have an enormous housing shortage. So that seems like an obvious solution: is any building or any structure that can be converted to housing affordably. Let's try to do that, and that solves two problems at once.
But you have to build a lot of bathrooms and closets. I mean, the floor plans are just totally different.
So like take 61 Broadway as an example, right? That has a narrow tower, so you can do that. It has a lot. If you have an office building, it has a lot of central plant in the middle of the building that goes away, that creates more open space. So you're right, the footprint needs to work. The second big thing about this is the values of those buildings have to be so low that you have to then, it's almost land price to be able to make that work, right? So to make it work, you need to be purchasing those buildings between $200 and $300 a foot, which is, very, very, it could be 20 to 30% of what someone had invested in those buildings historically, right? So you need this capitulation in values, which is happening in some buildings, and we're looking at it in a number of buildings today as an alternative. But it's not going to be the solve-all, particularly for affordable housing, because it does not work. By the way, if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to solve our low-income housing crisis, I'm also going to add on to this, these all have to be, net zero green energy, and by the way, they all need to be union labor, because nothing gets done, right? So we got to solve the problem, which is we have urban centers that need to be live, work, play, and to have people live, you need to convert buildings where they can live, and we should create any amount of housing that we can in New York City.
Couple seconds left. The kind of center of gravity of the city has shifted from east to west, right, over the last pick your number of years. Is there a limit to that without more infrastructure and more subways? I mean, Hudson Yards is great, but it's kind of hard to get to. At what point does that shift, kind of start to slow down?
Yeah, I think it already has slowed down, and I think, again, this speaks about intentionality and policy, right? I mean, the whole west side that's happened here in Lower Manhattan and then all the way up to Hudson Yards, that was intentional policy. The whole Hudson River Park Trust, the walkway along there, right? It created a reason for people to be there. The same thing has happened now in Grand Central, right, with the East Midtown rezoning that's happened, that's now taken old buildings to be new buildings, the opening of the Grand Central, the new terminal, what do they call it, Midtown, Madison something, whatever they call it now, some new name, but whatever, there's a whole new train station under Grand Central Terminal. So it's worked, but that sort of has now balanced that east-west a little bit more.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Let's appreciate it.